Hello, good evening. I hope you're all doing well. My name is Eileen Reavey, and I work for the organization National Popular Vote. National Popular Vote is a nonprofit whose sole mission is to pass the National Popular Vote bill, which, when in effect, will guarantee that the winner of the Electoral College is the candidate who won the National Popular Vote, thus making every vote in our presidential elections equal for the first time. Tonight, we are going to be discussing some of the most common myths and misconceptions that people think about the way that we elect the president currently and about how the system will work if we have a national popular vote. So we're going to talk about them and talk about how to answer them. So this is intended as a training webinar for people who have a little bit of an understanding of the National Popular Vote bill already. If you don't, that's okay. This is a good way to still pick up information about it, but please know that this is not an introductory webinar where we're going to be covering the very basics about the bill. We're going to be going into a little bit more detail here. So if you are watching via Zoom, please submit any questions that you have using the Q&A feature that you should see on the bottom of your screen. I'll keep an eye on those and either answer them in the moment or towards the end of the event. I do have time set aside for that. Please do know that we've got over 100 people on so far, just in the first 2 minutes. So I might not be able to get to all of the questions that are submitted. So if I don't answer it, that's why. It's just for a lack of time. So we in this webinar are just going to jump right in. Like I said, we're not doing too much intro. We're just talking right away about the different myths and misconceptions people have about the bill. So with that, what is the National Popular Vote bill? So if you're going to be an advocate for this bill, you want to make sure that you're describing the bill correctly. So how do we do that? The National Popular Vote bill would guarantee the presidency to the candidate who receives the most popular votes in all 50 states and DC. This is a bill passed by states to change how they vote in the Electoral College. And it works by replacing state winner-take-all laws with a new state law that awards the state's electoral votes to the candidate who wins the popular vote in all 50 states in DC. And it's very important to mention whenever you're describing this bill, the second key part of it, which is that the bill only goes into effect when states with 270 electoral votes have been committed to the compact. So the reason that this is important to emphasize that, the enactment clause, is because we want people to know that, if your state passes this, they're not doing it on their own. Their bill, or excuse me, their law doesn't change immediately. This is something that the change only occurs in states when the outcome is guaranteed to change. So when we have enough electoral votes committed to the National Popular Vote plan that are a majority of the Electoral College, which is currently 270, that's enough electoral votes to win a president. And so when you have, or to win the presidency. And so when you have that many committed to the National Popular Vote winner, that is how you can guarantee the presidency to the National Popular Vote winner. You'll also notice we consistently say that this is a bill that will guarantee the presidency of the candidate who receives the most popular votes in all 50 states in DC. Emphasizing that all 50 states in DC, because sometimes people think, oh, well, your bill only adds up the popular votes from the states that are participating, and that doesn't sound fair. And so by emphasizing, nope, this adds up the votes from all 50 states in DC, regardless of if they're in the compact or not, that helps people realize that, yes, this truly is calculating the National Popular Vote winner, because we don't want people walking away with the misunderstanding that it only adds up votes from certain states. That wouldn't be making every vote equal, and is certainly not what we want people to think about our bill, because that's not correct. All right, next up, the myth that people think that, well, the current system usually works fine. So if you're thinking that, and people say that to you, you want to respond with, well, does it really? Because it doesn't. 5 of our 46 presidents have been elected despite getting less votes than their opponent. So when people say it usually works fine, countering with a stat like that, 5 of our 46 presidents have come into office this way. That's a pretty high percentage, right? That's, effectively 10% of our presidents have come into office despite not having even a plurality of voters behind them. Then specifically, if you look at the last 20 years, we've had two divergent elections, which is the term that we use when the popular vote winner is the electoral college loser and does not become the president. And in addition to that, we've had two near misses where it almost happened two more times just in the last 20 years. So when you're looking at that and thinking, well, if it usually works fine, but now in just the past 20 years, we've had it go essentially the wrong way twice and almost have go the wrong way an additional two times, that will cause a lot of people to stop and think, maybe it's not working so fine right now. Because current system gives a lot of people uncertainty and unfortunately can undermine people's belief in the fairness of our elections because they look at it and say, well, this person got more votes, but this person ended up in the White House. This is different than how almost every other single office in the country is elected. And it makes people question the legitimacy of the person who was elected. So expanding on those points, specifically for when we're talking about we're in an era of close elections, when I talk about the two near misses, I'm referring to the 2004 election and the 2020 election. So specifically, in 2004, if 60,000 more voters in Ohio had cast their ballots for John Kerry instead of George Bush, John Kerry would have won the state of Ohio, won the Electoral College, and gone on to be the next president of the United States, despite losing the popular vote by a larger margin than Donald Trump did in 2016. So if 60,000 votes sounds like a lot, it's important to keep in mind that 115 million ballots were cast in that election. So 60,000 votes going the other way was absolutely a possibility. And so just the first election after the 2000 election, we came very close to having it happen again, but this time putting a Democrat in the White House over a Republican popular vote winner. The second near miss was in 2020. So last year, people might think, oh, well, Joe Biden won the popular vote by 7 million. It wasn't that close, even if it, felt close in those final days. Eventually, once all the votes were counted, it wasn't that close. But truly, if less than 22,000 voters in 3 states had changed their minds, then we would have had a different outcome for who won the Electoral College. So breaking down that math a bit, if 5,200 voters in Arizona, around 5,900 in Georgia, and 10,300 voters in Wisconsin had voted for Donald Trump instead of Joe Biden, then Donald Trump would have won the 37 electoral votes from those states. So the very narrow margins there. And what would have happened in that instance is there actually would have been a tie in the Electoral College. Now, the Electoral College tying is something that people don't often think about as a possibility, but it in fact is a possibility. And in the event of a tie, or if not neither candidate, say there were 3 candidates and no one got a majority which of the electoral votes, which of course currently is 270, when that happens, the decision goes to the US House of Representatives. However, it is not that every, the 435 members of Congress each have an individual vote. The vote in the House is on a one state, one vote basis. And even though Democrats have in the current Congress have a majority of Congress members, They do not control a majority of state delegations. Republicans do. So we know that Republicans would have then voted for Donald Trump to be the next president, and he would have gone on to have a second term despite the 7 million vote deficit that he had in the popular vote. So both of those instances, we were very, very close to having an election go the other way once again. And then, of course, the other two that we're the most familiar with are the 2016 election and the 2000 election. Next myth. People say, well, the national popular vote bill isn't going to happen. You know, that's a nice idea, but there's no way it's going to happen. And so when people say something like this, you want to point to the many validators of the progress we've made so far. So number one, this bill has already been passed by 15 states and DC. We have 195 of the necessary 270 electoral votes. So we're already over 70% of the way towards enactment. So people saying it will never pass, there's really not good reasoning to think that, because we're already over 70% of the way of making it happen. You also can point to the fact that this bill has already been supported by over 3,500 state legislators. We've passed at least one chamber in 9 additional states in previous legislative sessions, and those 9 states collectively have 88 electoral votes. So if we just passed the bill in the states where we've previously made progress, that would be more than enough electoral votes to make this bill go into effect. You can also point to the fact that very recently in 2019, we passed 4 states, which is the most amount of states that we had ever passed in 1 year, which shows that this is something that is continuing to gain in popularity. And looking at the Q&A, I'm just going to provide a clarifying question. So under the National Popular Vote bill, whoever wins the most votes in all 50 states and DC will become the president. So that is the person who wins the national popular vote. So the states that participate in the compact say, we want our electoral votes to go to the person who won the most votes across the country. So that's the national popular vote winner. And so once enough states have come together to have 270 electoral votes that agree to this plan, then they change their law, and so their electoral votes go to the national popular vote winner. And so this bill only goes in effect in those states when we have at least 270 electoral votes committed to the compact. So I hope that answers your question, Gordon, to provide a little bit of background there. All right. Next up, continuing on the idea of national popular vote will never pass, this is just a map showing the progress that we've made so far. The green states show where the bill has already been passed, and the states are represented with each square as one electoral vote. That's why it's shaped the way that it is. The orange indicates states where we've passed at least one legislative chamber, and the yellow indicates the state where we have been passed by both by both chambers. The question I get a lot about that one, in Nevada, unfortunately, the bill was vetoed by Democratic Governor Steve Sisolak in 2019. So that's why that one's a special instance there. And then blue indicates states where we've had at least a hearing in one legislative committee in that state. So you can see we've had a lot of progress on this bill in most of the states around the country. The next myth is that national popular vote and this movement to change the way we elect the president is a partisan movement. This is not true. So the National Popular Vote organization started in 2006. So this is not about the 2016 election. It wasn't a reaction to Donald Trump. We were in existence a full decade before he was elected. So it's not a left or a right issue. This is an American issue that puts voters first and very simply says that every vote should be equal. If you look at the endorsers that we have, you can see that Democrats, Republicans, and independents across the country have supported this proposal, have voted for this proposal, and our National Advisory Board is made up of people from all across the political spectrum. And I am seeing some questions pop up in the chat. Please, if you can, just note that if you want it to be answered live, putting it in the Q&A will be your better shot of making sure that I can see it. All right, next up. This is abolishing the Electoral College, which quite simply is not correct. So the National Popular Vote Bill changes how states appoint the electors who vote in the Electoral College. This bill does not abolish the Electoral College or change the US Constitution in any way. So again, people saying this is abolishing the Electoral College, that is just not correct. Similarly, folks might say, well, you're going around the Constitution, you're sidestepping the Constitution or going against its intent. No, we're using the process laid out in the Constitution for states to use their power to select the president. States have the authority to award their electors however they like. And so we're asking state legislators to consider that responsibility and evaluate if the current system is working for their constituents and for the country. Where that authority comes from is Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution. So specifically, the 17 words that give the instructions to state legislators for how they can choose to award their electors is each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors. So that's the entirety of the instructions for state legislators on how they should be awarding their electors. It's entirely up to them. So by asking state legislators to consider that responsibility and consider if the way that they're doing it now is really in the best interest of their citizens, that's not going around the Constitution or sidestepping it. That is following exactly the instructions in the Constitution, that it's up to the state legislators, which is why we're taking this issue to them and asking them to consider if a national popular vote would be better. The power of states here is to award their electors however they like is an exclusive plenary power of the states. So this is the same power that they use to have the winner-take-all laws that 48 states use, or the congressional district method that 2 states use. Neither of those are mentioned in the Constitution, but they are allowable and constitutional because it's entirely up to the state legislatures for how they award their electors. Next up, you should be pursuing a constitutional amendment instead. So there are 2 ways to move to a national popular vote. Just because people are more familiar with one way doesn't mean that that was what you should be focusing on. So if someone says this, you can just ask them, well, why? Or why would you think that? Or you can just say, nope, I don't agree with you. Because the way that we are advocating for is a way that has already gained a lot of traction. We're already 70% of the way towards making it happen. There is more cross-partisan support for this national popular vote bill than there is for abolishing the Electoral College. And because of the fact that it is working through the Electoral College and through the states to create this change. Next up, the myth that congressional consent is required. So congressional consent is not required. People often think this because you think, hang on, isn't there something in the Constitution about interstate compacts needing congressional consent? So yes, Article 1, Section 10 says that congressional consent is required for interstate compacts. However, the Supreme Court has ruled that consent is only necessary for compacts that encroach upon federal supremacy. Now, this bill does not encroach upon federal supremacy because awarding electors is a state decision, and in fact, a decision explicitly left up to the states in the Constitution. So we don't think that we need congressional consent. Honestly, most of our opponents of this bill agree with this point that we don't need congressional consent. That being said, if after our bill reaches 270 electoral votes, the Supreme Court decides to overturn 100 years of precedent and say that we need congressional consent, that's okay. We will go and get it at that time by lobbying Congress the same way that we have lobbied every single state legislature across the country on our bill. Next up, the persistent myth that, well, we shouldn't make this change because it's not what the founders intended. So when running into comments like this, it gets really good to remember a few things. So, number one, the framers of the Constitution took 30 votes over 22 separate days on how to elect the president. They went back and forth, voting in a national popular vote, voting it out, voting for different types of methods. And you know what they didn't vote on? Not a single one of those votes was on the winner-take-all method that 48 states use today and is effectively what people think of as the way we elect the president currently. So the winner-take-all method is not in the Constitution. It was not debated at the Constitutional Convention. It's not mentioned in the Federalist Papers. It was used by only 3 states in our first presidential election, and all 3 repealed it by 1800. So it wasn't until 1828 that a majority of states adopted the winner-take-all method of awarding electoral votes. That was 41 years after the Constitution was drafted. So the framers, what they did intend was leaving it up to the states to decide how the electors were chosen. And we are looking to state legislatures to change their state law exactly as the framers intended. They left it up to the state legislatures. We are asking the state legislatures to weigh in on this. And overall, I think it's just good to keep in mind that the way we elect the president now is just nothing like it was at the founding of our country. In the beginning, only 5 states even allowed a very select, specific type of citizen to vote for the president in any form. And we know that who could vote and how people vote for president has regularly evolved since the founding of our country. So saying that we shouldn't have national popular vote now because it's not what the founders intended isn't accurate and is just an argument that doesn't really hold up. Next up, a common refrain we hear from opponents is, well, we're a republic, not a democracy. And this is kind of thrown out as a gotcha line often. But let's talk about what those words actually mean. So republic, as used in the Federalist Papers, means that citizens do not rule directly, but instead elect office holders to represent them and conduct the business of government. Today, we also refer to that as a representative democracy. So no, we aren't a direct, pure democracy where every single citizen votes on every single matter. And electing the president by national popular vote doesn't change that. Moving to one person, one vote for selecting the one office holder that represents all of us is not going to suddenly transform our government into one where we all go down to our state capitals and vote on every single issue and have to go to every town hall meeting in our cities and townships to vote on every single item. No, we're just changing the method of the way in which the office holder is selected. That doesn't change anything about us being a republic. We have a constitution that grants us rights and makes it so that even a majority of voters or office holders cannot undo those rights. None of that changes just because we have a national popular vote. All right, next up. Myth that a state could withdraw from the compact in order to deny their electoral votes to the national popular vote winner. So this is an important one. And a common misunderstanding, and honestly, a concern that people have more since November of 2020, and some of the speculations that were out there about things that legislators in particular states might try and do to change the outcome of the election in their state. So a state cannot withdraw from the compact between July 20th of a presidential election year and 6 months later, which is Inauguration Day the following year. And this is a really important 6-month blackout period that covers everything from when the conventions meet and officially nominate their candidates to the entire general election, the entire voting period in all 50 states and DC. It covers the day that electors meet and cast their ballots. It covers the day that Congress counts the ballots all the way up until the next president is inaugurated. And the reason that a state cannot join or withdraw during that period is exactly because we don't want states to be able to try and game the system in favor of a particular candidate. And this prevents that because it says you can't join or leave even after July 20th up to January 20th. And that's even before the candidates are officially nominated. And often, I guess I apologize, I should be at the bottom of this slide, is that this isn't something that is enforced by a national popular vote or a Secretary of State or a governor, but is enforced by the impairments clause of the US Constitution. And no state in the history of our republic has ever left an interstate compact without adhering to the terms of that compact. So once they enter into this agreement, they're saying we agree to these terms, and the terms of our compact say you cannot withdraw between this time period. So it's enforced with the backing of the Constitution and would be upheld by the Supreme Court. Next up, there would be recount chaos is a fear that people have. And so for this, it's important to keep in mind that counting the votes the first time isn't impossible. So counting them a second or a third time before the deadline in December isn't impossible either. And we do know that recount laws vary from state to state. And so any recount issues that people would theoretically be concerned about under a national popular vote could just as easily happen now. So people being concerned about that, about the way that states recount their ballots, that's a separate issue. If you're concerned about that because of national popular vote, you should be just as concerned about it now. Now, that being said, our thought is that enactment of the national popular vote bill is the perfect time for Congress to consider if a federal recount law is needed ahead of the next presidential election. Congress has the constitutional duty to set the time, manner, and place of our federal elections, including the presidency. They have the ability to set a federal recount law just for this election. And if they decide that that is necessary, we think that after our bill is in effect and we know that it's going to be the way the next presidency is decided, is the perfect time for them to consider if they need to make any revisions so that there is consistency between all 50 states and DC on this issue. Notably, you'll notice I keep mentioning DC, and that is because they do have 3 electoral votes that they can use to vote for. So even though they don't have representation in Congress, they were given 3 electoral votes through a constitutional amendment. Next up, people being concerned about faithless electors upsetting the outcome of the election. So we know that, so a faithless elector is when someone is, nominated by, let's say in this particular example, the Democratic Party to be an elector for their state. The Democratic candidate gets the most votes in their state, or if national popular vote is in effect, gets the most votes nationwide. That person goes and casts their ballot, but votes for someone else, someone other than the Democratic candidate. So that is the term that we use for a faithless elector. So theoretically, Could we still have this happen under the National Popular Vote bill? Yes, because this is controlled by a different part of state law on if states allow this or not. It varies from state to state on if they allow faithless electors. But it's not something to be worried about. Why? Only one time in our nation's history, back in 1796, has an elector ever cast a faithless ballot that they reasonably could have thought would change the outcome of the election. That is the only instance that we have. Every other time we've had a faithless elector, they've done it knowing that it wouldn't change the outcome of the presidency. And so the idea that people are going to be voting, against the candidate that they very likely worked to elect, when that's happened in recent history, it's been to make a political point, as we saw, in the 2016 election, not because people thought that it would change the outcome of the election. Notably, we didn't have any in 2020. Beyond that, on if it being extremely unlikely, faithless electors upsetting the election is actually less of a concern under national popular vote as compared to the current system. And the reason for that is because with a national popular vote, the electoral college margin will actually be heavily weighted, very likely towards the national popular vote winner. Because if we look at our pool of electoral votes, there's 538 currently. We know that at least 270 of them are going to go to whoever won the national popular vote winner. Of the remaining 268 electoral votes, it's very likely that whoever won the national popular vote is also going to have won the most votes in some of those states. And so their electoral votes will pile on to that victory. And you're going to just have a larger margin. You could even have a 400 electoral vote win theoretically under a national popular vote or more. So if one person for some reason decides to be a faithless elector, it's going to fall into the category of grandstanding. They're doing it to make a point, not because they think it can change the outcome of the election. Next up, sometimes people think that this will keep third parties off the ballot, but this is not true. Ballot access has nothing to do with the National Popular Vote bill. Candidates are not guaranteed to be on the ballot in every state under our current system. So certain candidates not being on the ballot in every state is simply a function of states running elections rather than the federal government. States sets different requirements for getting on the ballot. And so this is something that is not changed by national popular vote. Next up, the concern that, well, candidates are going to be elected with only 15% of the vote. And the thinking here is because of the fear that, oh, well, you're not requiring a majority of votes. You're not requiring someone to get 50% plus one. You're just requiring whoever gets the most votes to win. However, again, like with many things with national popular vote, it's one of those things that when you really think about it and think about the math, you realize logic is on our side. So the lack of an electoral college type system is not what prevents 15 candidates from running for governor or US Senate in your state in the general election. We will still have primaries and a general and a two-party system in this country. And there's no reason to think that we'll see candidates elected with only 15% of the vote. When you do see multiple candidates running and someone winning with maybe not that many votes, that happens in nonpartisan local races, like your city council or even maybe your mayor's races. We don't see that happening in general elections where it's a partisan race. You don't have a Democrat and a Republican running and 6 third-party candidates who are equally competitive with each other. That's just not how our system works. And so throwing it out there that, oh, that's suddenly going to happen because we have one person, one vote in our presidential elections is just not a valid argument. We're going to have when we have one person, one vote and a national popular vote for our presidential elections, that's going to be the way that we elect every governor in this country, every US senator, almost all of our members of Congress, your state legislators in almost every state are elected this way. So it's not this new untested system. It's a system that we're all pretty familiar with, and it's just applying it to the presidency. Next up, the myth that this will incentivize voter fraud and voter suppression. This one, honestly, if someone brings this to you, you can very happily answer that actually the opposite is true. The current system provides huge incentives for voter suppression or voter fraud because a small number of votes in a battleground state can affect the popular vote in that state enough to swing the election and swing that state's electoral votes, which is what really matters because the swing states are the one who control who the next president is. With a national popular vote, you can take away that hyper focusing that can happen, and any voter fraud or voter suppression would have to occur on a national scale all across the country to have a chance at changing the overall outcome of the election. So if you want more specific examples of that, in 2020, you would have needed to have changed less than 22,000 votes in 3 states to swing the election the other way. But if we'd had a national popular vote and all of the vote totals being the same, you would have had to have swung the vote counts 7 million votes all across the country. One of those things is a lot easier than the other. So the current system provides incentive for both voter suppression and voter fraud. A national popular vote would make our electoral system stronger. Next up, the fear that Republican states will never pass this bill. People think this, it's good to point to the progress that we have made with Republicans across the country. So notably, this bill was endorsed by the Conservative Party of New York in 2014 when this bill was passed by the Republican-held Senate in New York. 48 Republicans voted for the bill. Our bill has passed Republican-held chambers in Oklahoma and Arizona as well. And, as recently as 2018, a majority of Republican senators in the Michigan legislature sponsored the national popular vote bill. So we've continued to see bipartisan support for this even after the 2016 election. Related to that, people saying, well, people in battleground states shouldn't support this. The important thing to keep in mind here is that if you are in a battleground state and maybe you're talking to your peers and they're saying, I don't know, it seems like we benefit from the current system and we should just stick with it. Battleground status is fleeting. You can be a battleground state in one election and just be completely safely either Democratic or Republican the next election, and no one will be coming to your state or listening to you. And there isn't a middle ground here. You're either hyper relevant or you're irrelevant in our presidential elections. And if you're living in a battleground state, I would think you wouldn't want to bank on that. You wouldn't want to just hope that you're going to continue to be relevant or that you're going to continue to live in a state where your vote is relevant, because you know that it very quickly can change. Versus with a national popular vote, you know that your vote's going to be equal in every single election. Next up, the thought, well, would the congressional district method be better? To answer this, the congressional district method, so this is a system that Maine and Nebraska use, and it says it's essentially winner take all, but at the congressional level instead of the state level. So if you win the most votes within a congressional district, you get the 1 electoral vote for that district, and then whoever wins the most votes in that state gets the 2 at-large electors. This system doesn't make every vote equal. It would not guarantee the presidency to the candidate who wins the most votes. And if it were applied nationally, say we had a constitutional amendment to make this happen in all 50 states, it would shrink the number of voters deciding the election even further because we'd have battleground congressional districts rather than battleground states. We know currently, some congressional districts are 70% Democratic or 70% Republican. No one's going to wonder who's going to win the electoral vote from that district in an election if all of the states were using the system. So you'd be boiling it down to a handful of battleground districts around the country. Beyond that, if you are someone who doesn't like gerrymandering of congressional districts for partisan purposes, Nothing would incentivize gerrymandering of our congressional districts more than making not just a seat in the US House of Representatives up for grabs, but an electoral vote for the presidency up for grabs. Related myth is people saying, well, the proportional method would be better. This is a system where you allocate the electoral votes within a state proportionally. So let's take Oregon, for example. They have 7 electoral votes. Oregon consistently votes around 55% to 42%, 55% for the Democratic candidate, 42-ish% for the Republican candidate, and then, a varying percentage for the third party candidate. What would happen if there was a proportional method applied would be, okay, we know 4 electoral votes are going to go to the Democrat, 3 are going to go to the Republican. So that is how it would be applied. If you do it in a larger state, you might know that, okay, this 20 are going to go this way, 15 are going to go the other way, and maybe 1 or 2 are up for grabs. But this is a system that doesn't make every vote equal as well. It doesn't guarantee the presidency to the candidate who won the most votes. And similar to the congressional district method, if we applied it nationally, once again, it shrinks the number of voters deciding the election even further, because we'd still have safe states, and we'd still have, a way of knowing, okay, it's I, as a candidate for president, I don't have a chance to change the percentages enough here to switch an electoral vote. So I'm going to concentrate my campaign in the states where I can do that, which by and large is going to actually benefit the larger states since they have more electoral votes up for grabs. The reason that I'm referring to these with whole numbers is because electors are people, and unless there's a constitutional amendment to change that, you would not be able to do this out to certain decimal points. Both of these reforms are really just not big enough fixes. There's something that you can change within a state, but it doesn't fix it at a national level. It doesn't tackle the overall system of the Electoral College the way that the National Popular Vote bill does. Our bill brings states together to work on reforms. Next up, the myth around small states and people thinking that they currently have an advantage. But if you look at the small states, so let's take the 13 smallest states that have 3 or 4 electoral votes, they are actually the most disadvantaged and ignored group of states under the current state-by-state winner-take-all method of awarding electoral votes. And the reason for this is because political power in our presidential elections comes from being a closely divided battleground state, and almost none of the small states are competitive in the presidential election. They're not competitive because they're small, the same way that California isn't competitive because it's big. Being big or small, rural or urban, doesn't really matter when it comes to the presidential election. All that matters is if your state happens to have a closely divided population in an election year. That's where all of the power comes from. People think, well, no, they have extra electoral votes per person, right? You have to have a smaller number of voters come out to turn out the 3 electoral votes in Wyoming than you do per electoral vote in Florida or in Texas. And while that math, is accurate, at the end of the day, no one's wondering how Wyoming's going to vote, or Alaska or Vermont or South Dakota or North Dakota or Montana or Delaware or DC. Those are our 8 states that all have 3 electoral votes. Again, DC being included in that because of the 23rd Amendment. All of them, we know how they're going to vote before the election even begins. They're either safely Democratic or safely Republican. So those, quote, extra weight that they have doesn't get them any further because all the power comes from being a battleground state. And if you look at the 13 smallest states right now, 6 of them are decidedly Republican, 6 of them are decidedly Democratic, 1 is sometimes a swing state. Related to that, people say, well, even if that's true, the small states are never going to get on board. But to that, DC, Hawaii, Delaware, Vermont, and Rhode Island, legislators in those states have already signed on to our bill because they recognize that their voters don't have any power under the current system, and they would benefit from having every vote be equal. Next up is people saying, well, okay, but the small states are supposed to have an advantage, which just isn't correct. At the founding of our country, the tension was not actually between the small states and the big states, and it wasn't concocted to give small states power. The tension was between slaveholding and non-slaveholding states. Where states do have equal representation is actually in the U.S. Senate. So there's nothing that says or would allude to the idea that small states are supposed to have an advantage in the Electoral College. Next up is the myth that candidates are only going to campaign in big states if we have a national popular vote. And this is one that I know why people think this. They think they're just going to go to big states or big cities, which I'll get on next. But if you think about it, people are all over. Even if we do have more people in California, New York, Florida, Texas, and Illinois, the entire population is still spread out throughout the entire country. And serious candidates for the office are going to go after every vote that matters. And every vote in every state would matter in every presidential election under the National Popular Vote Plan. So a voter in a small state is just as important as a voter in any other state. People often think they're just going to go to the two big states. If you look at this little cartoon we have at the bottom, it shows that, in California, they have a population of 37.3 million. And obviously, of course, California, under the winner-take-all system, went for Hillary Clinton, their electoral votes. In the 2016 election, there were 14 states their population was roughly equal to California, 37.9 million, so actually a little bit more. They broke out. Donald Trump had a lead, a little bit greater, but similar to the lead Hillary Clinton had in California. And those red states voted 61% for Trump, while California went 62% for Hillary Clinton. So you have roughly equal populations there, 37.3 million to 37.9 million. You could no more ignore the 37.9 million people living in those 14 states and expect to win and be running a competitive campaign than you could ignore the 37 million people in California. So people are all over the country, even if we think that, obviously some more of them are in certain states, but candidates are still going to go all over the United States. We know within battleground states currently, candidates go all over. They don't just, for example, in Pennsylvania, they don't just go to Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and every presidential election cycle. They go all over the state because voters are all over. And so if you want to know more about this, we've got a memo on our website that digs into the data showing that. But under a national popular vote, the candidates are going to go all over. Very similarly, they're not just going to camp out in the big cities, which is kind of the next thing that people often bring up. This is a common misconception that I think stems from people thinking that cities are a lot bigger than they actually are. And in fact, if you look at the 100 largest cities, with number 100 on that list being Spokane, Washington, with 208,000 people, that only makes up 19% of the US population. It just so happens that 19% is the same number of people that live in rural America. So to win a national popular vote, you can't just campaign to the 19% of city dwellers or the 19% of people in rural America. You have to speak to the 62% of Americans who live in the suburbs and are evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans. So before I move on to questions, good things to keep in mind is that, you're a volunteer, you don't have to have all the answers. So as you're going out and talking to your state legislator or, people in your community or giving a presentation, it's always okay to refer people to our website and say, I'm not sure about the answer to that, but I'm sure the answer is online. We have an answering myths section of our website, which gets into the details on all of these, and you can always link people there. And you often, if you're out presenting, might come across people saying, well, why aren't you working on this reform or that, like ballot access or campaign finance? And it's good to note that this is just one reform, and it doesn't stop people from also supporting or opposing other reforms as well. Here is our website as well as the Answering Myths link that I mentioned. And we do have a book, which is, a textbook. But if you're interested, you can download it for free online at everyvoteequal.com. If you want to get involved, you can help us pass this bill in your state. So if this has not yet passed in your state, number one, write your legislator, nationalpopularvote.com/write, WRITE. You put in your zip code, and then it'll pull up a form for you to send an email to your state senator, state representative, and governor, letting them know that you want them to take action on this. You can sign up to volunteer so that you can get linked in with a volunteer group in your state so that you can go out and give presentations to your community. And if you live in a state where the bill has already passed, you can still help us with those campaigns in those other states when they're happening, which happens at various times throughout the year.